I have a bomb.
From covered-up alien invasions to the monsters of the deep, there's no doubt that our world is a mysterious place. But nothing is more confusing than the disappearance of one of the most notorious criminals in the history of time. Need to know more? Then join us as we take a look into the crazy case of D.B. Cooper. The story surrounding the disappearance of D.B. Cooper. It all started on the afternoon of the 24th of November 1971, which saw a man by the name of Dan Cooper sitting alone in an airport lounge. After approaching the counter and purchasing a one-way ticket on Flight 305 to Seattle, Washington, what was to become one of the greatest mysteries of all time was set into motion. According to passengers of the same flight, Cooper was a relatively quiet man in his mid-40s. Remember, due to the fact that he was dressed to the nines in a business suit with a black tie and immaculate white shirt. After sitting down in his seat and putting on his infamous black shades, he ordered what the stewardess remembers being a bourbon and soda. But it's when she delivered the drink back to him that things got interesting. While waiting for the plane to take off, he informed the stewardess that he had a bomb in his bag, asking her nicely to sit beside him. He then gently opened his carry-on to show that it was indeed filled with a mess of wires, along with some reddish sticks that were assumed to be dynamite. He then instructed her to write down a message to be taken to the captain of the aircraft, requesting 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills. When the flight finally landed in Seattle, the authorities on scene, who had been informed of the hijacking, ensured that the money and parachutes would be exchanged for the passengers on board. And, true to his word, D.B. Cooper released all passengers but for some staff on the airplane, requesting that the aircraft be refueled for a flight to Mexico City. Knowing full well that they would be able to track the aircraft, authorities agreed to his demands and supplied him with the $200,000 he'd requested. The plane then took off for Mexico City, and when it landed, once more the authorities were ready to pounce on the unsuspecting hijacker. Unfortunately for them, Cooper had parachuted out of the plane somewhere between Seattle and Reno around 8 p.m. that evening. And it goes without saying, but he ended up taking the ransom money with him. The pilots and crew who remained on board spoke of how the hijacker never once threatened their lives during the escapade, but this didn't stop the FBI from launching an investigation into his whereabouts. But after investigating the crime for approximately 45 years, the federal agency has finally revealed that the investigation is dead, with all credible leads coming up short. It's a mystery that has somewhat become its own pop culture reference over the years, with many internet sleuths trying their best to figure out what actually happened to the infamous figure of D.B. Cooper. Did he make it safely to his landing zone with the ransom money in tow? Or did he perish in a free fall, never to be seen again? Well, if the blockbuster comedy Without a Paddle is to be believed, he actually landed safely but found no way of surviving the harsh realities of the wild. After making a home for himself in a nearby cave, he ended up burning the ransom to keep himself warm, perishing all alone. But the newest Marvel series, Loki, tells a different story, actually imagining the Asgardian antihero as the true identity of D.B. Cooper, with the power of the Bifrost saving him from the free fall he was in. But what really happened to D.B. Cooper after he had jumped from that plane? The name behind the legend. The first thing you should definitely know about this mysterious disappearance is that the criminal mastermind had never actually referred to himself as D.B. Cooper. As it turns out, this was one of the first memorable instances of fake news, which resulted in the misinformation media spreading the apparent fact that the hijacker referred to himself by that name. In actual fact, the man used the alias of Dan Cooper when he purchased his airplane ticket in Poland. An error of note, though, when reporting on the case, a reporter misheard the name and reported the alias as D.B. Cooper, not Dan Cooper as he was instructed to. It didn't take long for this news to spread, though, especially considering how little else was going on in the news cycle at the time. And since movies and series weren't widely available back then, watching the evening news was pretty much what every family did over dinner. And just like that, the legendary icon of D.B. Cooper was was brought into existence, even though he had never actually used that name in the first place. The true identity of D.B. Cooper. Despite the incorrect alias, news stations all across the globe participated with the FBI, releasing hand-drawn images of the man which had been recreated from the memory of the passengers on board Flight 305. And surprisingly enough, it seemed like everyone and their mother knew the true identity of D.B. Cooper was, resulting in the FBI's landline ringing off the hook. But after clearing around 1,000 suspects in the investigation, the federal agency had to admit defeat. They'd been thwarted by the genius hijacker, with not even a single arrest being made in the history of the 45-year investigation. Probably the best guess as to who D.B. Cooper actually took place back in April of 1972, which saw a man by the name of Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. attempting to extort around $500,000 in another hijacking that appeared to be similar to that of D.B. Cooper's. But after parachuting over Provo, the man was finally arrested and brought to justice on federal charges of air piracy. Although the means were very similar, McCoy simply didn't fit the description of D.B. Cooper. This didn't stop the conspiracy theorists from suggesting that he had clearly gotten plastic surgery in an effort to thwart identification parades. But since plastic surgery was nowhere near to the perfection required for this back then, and the crime had taken place just 5 months after the initial hijacking, it won't surprise you to hear that Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. was cleared of the Cooper-associated charges due to a lack of evidence. Things got even stranger from there though, with McCoy later escaping prison and being shot dead by police who were in the process of tracking him down. Definitely a curious end to the only suspect ever thought to be D.B. Cooper. The letters that followed the disappearance. Another curious fact that followed the disappearance of D.B. Cooper came in the form of around 6 letters, which claimed to be from the genius hijacker. According to reports, these letters were sent to a number of newsrooms and newspapers across the United States in the weeks following the mysterious incident. A grand total of 3 of these notes were cut and paste lettering from magazines, while another was handwritten and 2 others were typed using a typewriter. It must also be said that all but one of those letters was signed by D.B. Cooper, while the final letter was simply signed "A Rich Man." More often than not, these letters, which claimed to be D.B. Cooper, was aimed at antagonizing the FBI, stating everything from "thanks for the hospitality" to "I was simply stuck in a rut." But since the language used throughout the letters was not uniform, the FBI had to conclude that the letters in question weren't the work of a single person. That being said, this doesn't exclude the possibility that at least one of those letters was from the hijacker. Although we doubt it considering how it was signed D.B. Cooper rather than Dan Cooper, what is more likely is that members of the public who were intrigued in the case wanted to be a part of the mystery, and thus sent these letters in on behalf of D.B. Cooper. Some would say that this constituted the first catfishing case in the history of the world, and knowing the internet culture of today, this latter option is a lot more believable than the former. Some of the ransom was recovered. This wasn't the last time that we heard from D.B. Cooper though. According to reports from back in 1980, around $5,800 was discovered by an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram near the Columbia River. The FBI then went on to analyze the notes that were found just northwest of Vancouver, confirming that they were indeed a portion of the ransom requested by D.B. Cooper back in 1971. In fact, the 2 packets of cash that were discovered at the time each contained $120 Federal Reserve notes, and a third packet of around 90. Since they were all arranged in the same way and in order in which they were initially given to D.B. Cooper, it seemed like a slam dunk. But considering how the hijacker could have still had $14,200 on his person upon landing, he didn't find it difficult to disappear without a trace. What do you think of this mysterious disappearance?